What do you think? Okay, so we start off with our first president. Our first president was unanimously George Washington. The electors, there were 69 electors at the beginning of the American government. There were 69 electors, and they all voted, and each elector gets 2 votes. They vote for the person they like the best, and then the person they like second best. And the person that they all unanimously liked the best for this job was George Washington, who, by the way, had retired and gone back to Mount Vernon and was pretty happy there. But then Alexander Hamilton wrote to him and said, "You should come be president." And he was like, "I don't want to." And he said, "No, really, you should become president." So he was kind of roped back into dealing with the government because he got unanimous support to be the first president of the US. The person who got the most votes secondarily was John Adams. He got 34 of the 69, 34 of the votes, and then the other 35 were split between 10 other people. So he didn't get a majority of the second votes, but he did get more than anybody else. So he gets to be vice president, because that's how that works. How that works is the person who gets the most votes gets to be president, and the person who gets the second most votes gets to be vice president. Simple system. No parties. Very good not to have parties. They didn't have a two-party system. There were no parties at the time. As a matter of fact, in his farewell address, George Washington says, "Political parties may now and then answer the popular ends. They are likely in the course of time and things to become potent engines by which cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men will be able to subvert the power of the people and to usurp for themselves the reins of government, destroying afterward the very engines which have lifted them to unjust dominion." Quick translation of that is that George Washington is saying that political parties might seem like a good idea for the people, but ultimately what will happen is that ambitious men will use them so that they can advance their own careers, and then they can turn around and destroy the same machines that got them those careers.
That doesn't sound anything like that.
And that was a prediction George Washington made. It was completely uneducated and ignorant, because that's totally not what happened in the US at all. That was my sarcastic voice. Okay, so the first vice president is the person who receives the second most votes. And in this case, it was John Adams. He received 34 electoral votes, and the 35 remaining votes went between 10 other candidates. So the reason that he received such a large share of the votes himself is because his friends gathered around him and began to put out propaganda supporting him as a person for president. For office. Now, they all expected George Washington to win. So the question was just who's going to take that second in command post. There is some speculation that there were people who wanted to make sure that if the president was somebody from the South, Virginia, which George Washington was from the South, that the vice president should be somebody from the North. And so they organized and contacted people and wrote letters and wrote pamphlets, not quite campaigning exactly, but just trying to make sure that the electors from those northern states, and in some cases from the southern states, understood the benefit of having somebody from the Massachusetts Bay to support this person from the Chesapeake Bay. Let's bring us all together. There's even a possibility that there was some bullying going on there, some letters that Hamilton wrote that kind of bear that out, that he was out there convincing people that they had an obligation to vote for somebody from the North, and John Adams was their best bet. Because if they didn't, then boy, it sure was going to be hard to support any legislation that, supported their state. So he wrote a lot of letters. So what you end up with are basically two ideologies. There are people that want the states to stay powerful. There are people that want the states to stay powerful and send representatives to the Capitol, which is in New York City at this point, to do their voting for them, but basically retain a lot of power for the states. And then there are people that want to see all of the power kind of coalesce under a nation. Let's stop with this whole 13 states business and let's build a nation. And those are called federalists. So there are people who are federalists and people who are against that, anti-federalists, drawing all the power together. It's not quite a political party yet, but the federalists and the anti-federalists are definitely drawing lines in the sand. So Washington's job is basically to build up the executive branch and figure out what it's going to do and how it's going to do it. They've decided that the executive branch is responsible for the military, is responsible for foreign diplomacy, foreign action, foreign policy, and is arguably responsible for the budget of the federal government. George Washington does not feel qualified to do any of these things. So he has a military background. He's been in command of the entire military for the continent. I mean, he was in command of the entire Continental Army, and that's basically what they have right now. So he basically establishes himself as the Department of War, but he asks for help from experts on the others. And when he asks for help, he creates departments for them, and that's how we get our first cabinet. Is George Washington admitting that he can't do this job by himself and that he needs experts to help him. So he asks John Jay and then Thomas Jefferson. First he asks John Jay. Now, if you remember, John Jay was the guy over in France who went to England and said, France and Spain want to make a deal with us for a treaty that we like. How much better can you do, Britain? He negotiated the treaty that gave the Ohio River Valley to the colonists, that gave the Ohio River Valley to the Americans. So he's already got a lot of experience in foreign policy, so that's good. So he becomes the first Department of State, the leader of the Department of State. For the Treasury, George Washington asks for help from Alexander Hamilton. Now, Hamilton's expertise at this point is in correspondence, but he's managed to send and receive correspondence all over the colonies. And he has some pretty radical ideas about how the Treasury should be run. And George Washington just trusts him. So he gets put in charge of the Treasury. In 1789, so right after he is established as the president, he passes what's called the Judiciary Act of 1789. The point of this is to establish a court that is over all of the other courts of the states. The courts will have 6 justices, and their job will be to hear the cases that have gotten too big for the states to handle themselves. They establish courts, federal courts that reach into the states, so that divides all the states up into districts and gives those judges power over those districts. That's the system that we basically have now. Our whole country is divided into state courts, and those state courts are at, however the states want to manage them. But then there are crimes that are federal crimes or issues that are federal issues, and those are divided up into districts. I think there are 12, but I'd have to look to be sure of how many federal districts there are. I'm not sure how many off the top of my head, but I know there's not 50. There's not one for each state. But when he did so, he established the Supreme Court, and he appointed John Jay as the first Chief Justice. So now there's an opening in the Department of State. 94 districts?
Judicial districts, federal judicial districts.
Okay, I think we're talking about 2 different things here. Okay, well, I'll look it up later. It's not important. What's the idea is what was happening back then. But he appointed John Jay as the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and then moved Thomas Jefferson into that position in the state. So now he's got a Supreme Court, and he's got a Department of the State and the Department of the Treasury. And the Department of State is responsible for foreign policy, and the Department of the Treasury is responsible for figuring out how the federal government's money is going to be spent. Right off the top of the beginning of this, anti-federalists were worried because the Constitution, the way it's written, gives a lot of power to the federal government. Right off the top, they want to make sure there are people that worry about how much power the federal government has. And they're worried about pretty specific things. They are literally worried that given power, the federal government will turn around and do to the states exactly what the king has just done to the colonists. So what were some of the things that the king did that were just unacceptable to the colonists? Is anybody off the top of your head, can you remember any of them?
Taxation.
Taxation without representation, that's definitely one. What were some of the other things that the English government did to the colonists that they couldn't take, that they just couldn't deal with?
They made them put up the soldiers.
Right, the quartering acts, they made them provide houses for soldiers. They also they also had them arrested and convicted without a trial. They were able to search houses without any kind of warrants. What was another great big thing that the English tried to do? Yes.
Quartering soldiers.
Yes, quartering the military. What was another thing that they tried to do? That's right, they tried to take away the munitions from the militia. They tried to seize the armories from the militia. So the anti-federalists are afraid right from the beginning that the central powers of the Constitution gave the federal government the ability to do to the people what the king had just done to the colonists, the things that had kicked off the war to begin with. So Washington, recognizing this, now believe it or not, Washington is himself kind of an anti-federalist. He believes that the states should have enough power to govern themselves, and he believes the federal government should have responsibilities to protect the rights of the citizens. But he himself is actually kind of an anti-federalist. So he turns around and asks his friend, who is also from Virginia, Thomas Jefferson, to figure out how to put language in the Constitution that makes sure to stop the federal government from acting on those powers in such a way that they do to the states what the king had just done to the colonies. So Thomas Jefferson helped to draft the Bill of Rights. James Madison also wrote the Bill of Rights. So in cooperation with other anti-federalists, they draft what's called the Bill of Rights. Let's take a look for a second, shall we, at the Bill of Rights. Did y'all get a chance to look at this at all? Okay, how many of you have ever actually read the Bill of Rights? Because a lot of people claim to know what is in them, but doesn't. It's odd how often people don't actually. Okay, let me get this up on the screen here. Okay, you can find the Bill of Rights under your week 7. I'm gonna open it up in another screen. Okay, so the Bill of Rights is 10 amendments that were made all at once. Amendments have been made over time since then, so there are a lot of amendments, but these 10 specifically were written by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison to specifically check those powers. So starting from the top, the first one is religion. Why would that be the first right in the Bill of Rights? Yes.
Because that was like one of the main things about Britain, just like the reason why all the Puritans left, because just like it wasn't a place for them. Catholics were kind of getting discriminated against, like, oh, you'll just follow where the Pope goes and all that. They're just like, yeah, let's like just try to separate ourselves from Britain by just having freedom of religion.
Right. Most of the colonies were established with either the imposition of religion, like the Anglican colonies that had to continue to swear, fealty to the head of the church, which was the king, or were established in rebellion against those restrictions, like the Puritans, or like Maryland, which was a Catholic haven, or like the Quakers, which formed Pennsylvania. Most of the states had at their core a religious foundation and wanted to make sure that the government never tried to set up a state church, because they had just come from England's state church, where the King of England was head of the church. So the point of that First Amendment is to make sure that England can't do that. So I want you to take a look at these 10 amendments and actually read them with an eye towards why this one? Why did they include this amendment in the Bill of Rights? Why did we want to make sure? What historical event is it that we're trying to avoid here? Okay, and then pay attention to Amendments 9 and Amendment 10. In Amendment 9, the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. In other words, just because we say it specifically in the Bill of Rights does not mean that because we didn't say a right, it's not actually a right. Okay, just because we didn't include it doesn't mean it's not a right. And number 10, those powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved for the states. So if it doesn't specifically say in the Constitution that the federal government is responsible for something, the federal government has no right to make laws about it. Can anybody think of something that's not enumerated in the Constitution that might apply to this today? Who is it that, for example, makes a decision about marriage rights? No, the Supreme Court does not make laws about marriage rights, because it's not in the Constitution anywhere that the federal government gets to define marriage. It's the states. Right, that's why it is legal in Tennessee to marry your first cousin and illegal in Kentucky, which always surprised me because I had no idea my grandparents weren't legally married until they went across state lines and got married again at like 85. We had no idea. Yes, I'm the descendant of first cousins. My family tree is like this. Anyway, I'm just going to own it. So it is legal in Tennessee to marry your first cousin, and it is illegal in Kentucky because states get to make that decision. And any attempt by the federal government to make a decision about who is allowed to get married and who is not constitutionally protected, which is what the Supreme Court keeps finding. Over and over and over again, the Supreme Court keeps ruling that's not the federal government's job. So if it's not delegated by the Constitution, then it is reserved for the states.
Like the mask mandate.
Exactly like the mask. That's why there still is not a federal mask mandate, is because that is not a constitutionally protected federal. They don't have the power to do that federally.
Better example would be marijuana as well.
Oh my gosh, right? The reason that the federal government can, actually though, it was a federal law that made it possible for states to outlaw marijuana. So it'd be good if it got repealed on that basis. That would be cool. I'm sorry. I shouldn't weigh in politically, but the truth is it's just.
I don't really consider that political.
You don't think so?
No.
Okay, good. I'm glad.
I think as long as you're young, it doesn't matter which party you belong to.
Okay, let me get back into this.
Because like we-
I want you to look at the Bill of Rights and actually read it and ask yourself those questions, because the assignment today is going to be on the Bill of Rights. But a lot of people say, well, I know my rights, that's in the Second Amendment, or I know my rights, that's in the First Amendment, without ever actually having read it. It's important that you actually read it. So the Bill of Rights is supposed to appease those anti-federal sentiments so that they won't be afraid that the federal government will hold on to powers that they shouldn't actually have. Now on the debt side of the equation, Hamilton is trying to work on the fact that there is still no federal system of moving money around, which is a problem if they ever want to actually negotiate trade deals outside the US. There are a lot of states that are individually in a lot of debt because they had to fund their own militaries in the Revolution. So like the state of Massachusetts and the state of New York had to put together a militia and purchase weapons and pay soldiers. And in order to do that, they went into debt. So Hamilton believes that if the states are not in debt anymore, that they'll be able to get on their feet and they'll be more productive. So he makes a proposal that the federal government assume all of those debts and make those a federal debt and allow the states to get out from under these debts, which will make it so that they're not so hard on their constituents for collecting taxes to pay back their debts. And the other side of that is once he has assumed their debts, they owe the federal government money. Okay, so instead of owing money to several different entities that provided their weapons, that for example, Massachusetts has a debt with France at this point. Massachusetts owes France money. Well, if the federal government pays off that debt and then the federal government's responsible for it, then they can leverage that, they can use it. And they're planning on paying it off at par, which means they're not going to charge interest to the states. They're not going to make the states pay interest on it. They're just going to assume the debt's up. What that will do is that will pour money into the wealthiest residents of each state, which will then, what's the word? Find its way into the hands of the poor through the fact that the wealthy will spend it. Like rain, it will fall down from like a heavy cloud. It will trickle down, some might say. Alexander Hamilton is responsible for the first idea of trickle-down economics. Virginia, who is not in debt because they didn't just fight the war in large numbers, they actually provided a lot of the materials and a lot of the men to the government. So their debts are not very significant. Their post-war debts are not very significant. So they don't like this because they don't want to take on the debts of New York. They don't want to take on the debts of Massachusetts. So they fight him. And he has a meeting with Madison, Jefferson, and 3 other people where he negotiates with them to go ahead and vote for this measure. And in exchange for that, they'll move the capital to Virginia. And then that way Virginia will have the nation's capital. And they finally agreed to that. As long as the debts are paid at par, so there's no interest, then Virginia is okay being a part of it, as long as they can also have the capital. So they establish a city right on the Potomac, and they name it after the current president, who's Washington. And so that's why we have the capital right on the edge of Virginia in its own little miniature state. It's not actually separate at this point, it's part of Virginia. The capital of the whole country is in Virginia. One of the ways that he intends to fund this is by imposing the first tax on a domestic product. Now, they've taxed imports coming into the country as high as they can. But so they need to find a product that they can tax that's made in America that they can then, tax the sale of. And the one they just decided on is whiskey. Why whiskey? Anybody want to know? Yeah, at this point, during the Revolutionary War, the trade with sugar got cut off. So rum production went through the floor. So what happened is that people took extra grain from their farms in the western part of those states where they grew it. And since shipments were disrupted and it was harder to get the grain to the eastern markets, they started distilling it and making stills in their backyards. So whiskey production has gone up quite a bit. And a lot of the country has gotten hooked on it, on whiskey specifically. So it's kind of like, if they wanted to tax a domestic product that everybody was addicted to, but that was made locally, tobacco would have been a good one too. But that would have only affected the southern states that produce tobacco. The eastern part of most of the states makes whiskey. So almost every state has a segment of the population that makes it. And it doesn't affect one state more than others. But it's also really easy to track the sale of because it's moving so fast because everybody's drinking whiskey. Of course, some states object to this because they feel like it's easier for, the way that he sets up the tax, it's easier for the big whiskey producing places to deal with it, the large distilleries, than it is for the small farmers who are just making it in their backyard. It's an undue burden on them. So this causes a rebellion, kind of like Shays' rebellion. It's a rebellion of poor farmers who gather together and go, this is not fair. We're not being treated equally here. We're losing money because we can't ship our grain to market, and we can't take that grain and distill it into whiskey and then sell whiskey. Also, incidentally, just so you know, some of our employees are paid in whiskey. So basically, they're paying an income tax that other people don't have to pay. And that's not fair. So in Pennsylvania, we have this group of people who rises up specifically to fight this tax. They attack a tax collector and tar and feather him, and they protest at the tax offices. And Washington orders federal troops to go put down this rebellion. Now, some people suspect that Hamilton, whose idea this was, knew all along that this was going to happen and needed an example of somebody to march troops into so that they could see that the federal government was going to take responsibility for putting down local insurrections if it needed to, and that this was the easiest way to do it. That's one of them conspiracy theory things. But the idea is sound. The idea that the federal government, what we learned from this was that if a group of disgruntled farmers gets together and tries to mount an insurrection, that the federal government will march in state and federal troops to put it down. And that is a power that the Constitution gives them and that they will exercise it. So that's the point of the Whiskey Rebellion, is to show that insurrections will be put down by the federal government. Okay, so now we've got a healthy tax coming in from the whiskey. We've got the government funding the state's debts at par so that there's money flowing into the state economies. Now we need a national bank, something that European powers can negotiate with, so that they don't have to figure out how to negotiate money deals with Virginia and Massachusetts and New York and Rhode Island and Pennsylvania. Instead, they just with the United States federal government. This bank is Hamilton's idea. He wants to make sure that there is a national coinage, a national standard, and that all federal funding will be funneled through the same institution. He wants to establish a national bank. The anti-federalists hate this idea. They hate the idea of the federal government controlling their money. So Jefferson fights because he says specifically the Constitution doesn't give you this power. There's no place in the Constitution that says that the federal government will run its own bank. It's not in there, and the amendment that we made in the Bill of Rights says if it's not in there, it's in the power of the states. So you're doing the wrong thing by even talking about it. He turned around and said, well, Amendment number 9 says just because it's not listed in the Constitution doesn't mean we don't have that power. So he used Amendment number 9 to combat Jefferson using Amendment number 10, and eventually this will become the thing that they campaign against each other with. This will become the reason that Jefferson is able to get support, because he says, look, see, right off the bat, the federal government is seizing powers that they weren't supposed to have. Y'all should vote for me in the next election because I will make sure that doesn't happen. And now we have parties. Now we have Federalists and Anti-Federalists fighting each other on an issue of how we're going to go forward as a country. Are we going to seize powers for the federal government, or are we going to let the states do things the way that they're supposed to? So in the second election, Jefferson and Hamilton are running up against each other, like head to head. Not really, because Hamilton's not actually running. He's not one of the names on the ticket. But he is deciding who the people should vote for. So he is putting his support behind John Adams and saying, he doesn't want to be president. Hamilton doesn't want to be president. But he is saying, you should vote for John Adams because he represents the same values I do. And you all know that those values are what's going to make us prosperous. We're going to be able to be a trading empire just like Britain, just like France. If we can just get our finances together, then we'll be able to negotiate trade deals that'll put us at the top. I mean, we've got all these industries. We should be right up there at the top. And Jefferson is saying it's a dangerous road to go down, the federal government seizing power like this. And so right off the bat, you have Federalists and Democratic Republicans. People who believe that, you know, the representatives should vote and those representatives should be elected by the people and it shouldn't be centralized in the government. They call themselves Democratic Republicans and Federalists. John Adams wins the vice president in the second election, but by a much narrower margin. It's not 34 votes for John Adams and 35 votes for everybody else. It's 36 votes for John Adams and 23 votes for Thomas Jefferson, and it's getting closer and closer and closer and closer, okay? Meanwhile, in Europe, Enlightenment thinking has led to a French Revolution. They went back after our revolution and they said the people should rise up and take over this country too. But instead of just an army of citizens fighting on behalf of, you know, their own rights, they also beheaded 30,000 of their own nobles. 30,000 people went under the guillotine in the reign of terror that followed. So from 1793 to 1794, I should probably advance this one, huh? Sorry. From 1793 to 1794, the French are actually executing their own nobles. And they ask for America to come and help them with this revolution because they helped in their revolution. And Washington's response to that is basically, what you're doing is not what we did, okay? We promised we would help you if you had to seize your independence from, you know, we promised you we would help you establish yourselves as a republic and overthrow an oppositional monarchy, but we didn't agree to this because the backlash of the Reign of Terror is that other countries are going to start deciding that they're going to attack France. Austria is pretty pissed off that the peasants executed the Austrian princess that was the Queen of France, Marie Antoinette. So Austria is now going to attack France, and France is like, hey, America, remember how we helped you in your revolution? You need to come and help us. But President Washington says, this is not that. And we agreed on helping you in certain circumstances. This is not those circumstances. You guys have gone in a completely different direction than we expected. So what we're going to have to do is ask you to accept this neutrality treaty. John Jay and Alexander Hamilton and a couple of others write a treaty of neutrality for America to sign, saying that they will not come to Britain's aid in fighting France and they will not come to France's aid in fighting Britain. And Britain is pretty upset about that, and so is France. So Britain begins to funnel forces to attack French holdings in the West Indies. So Britain is now getting awfully close to American shores again. And they expect America to come to France's aid in the West Indies. They expect them to send ships to support the colonies in France. But when they don't, the government is split again, because Jefferson absolutely believes that America should go to France's aid. We should send our ships to the West Indies to defend French colonies against the British. We should do that. And John Jay says, no, we're going to fight the British up in the Ohio River Valley and make sure they leave those forts that they said they were going to leave. But other than that, we're not going to get involved. So by the time we get to the next presidency, because George Washington makes a decision that he's only going to run twice, he believes that it is in the country's best interest that a president be temporary. Even though people are like, you could run again, you could run as many times as you wanted to. We'll keep voting unanimously for you. He decides to step down specifically to preserve the idea of the president being the weakest member of government, being the person that everything doesn't depend on, making sure there isn't a king with a dynasty. He actually steps down on purpose with that in mind. So look at the margin between Jefferson and John Adams in the election of 1796. Can y'all see it up there? This margin. This is how this is now the presence of parties at work, of ideological parties who are supporting their candidates. John Adams barely wins, and he only actually is there for 4 years. France is still asking for American support. So under John Adams, he sends agents to go to France and negotiate with the French to figure out what they want and offer to help them. But just check and see whether or not they're helpable. So when they arrive, John Marshall and the other negotiators, when they arrive, they are encountered by an agents, X, Y, and Z, who refuse to tell them their names, who demand $250,000 to see the foreign minister. In other words, they can't even get an audience with the French government in order to actually talk about their involvement in French troubles before paying a $250,000 bribe to see that foreign minister. Well, the American negotiators are so incensed by this that they turn around and come back home, and then they publish all over the place that this is how they were treated. This is called the XYZ affair. French agents X, Y, and Z, who might not have even been connected to the French government, approach John Marshall and his negotiators and say, if you give us $250,000, we'll get you in to see the foreign minister. And the American negotiators, John Marshall is just like, oh, we don't have to put up with this, and comes back home. But the relationship between France is officially not helpful, is officially not good anymore. So the American Navy comes back home, and in retaliation for this treatment, sets its privateers at loose again. And American ships begin to loot French ships who are in the West Indies. And the American Navy becomes a bunch of pirates again. And the 3 ships that the American Navy have becomes dozens of ships that the American Navy has. So John Adams' presidency is not very long, but here are his big 3 contributions to the presidency. First of all, there is no more alliance with France. By the time John Adams is done, the French and the Americans are no longer friends. No more alliance. The second thing that he does is pass the Alien Act. The Alien Act makes it possible to deport people that you consider dangerous foreigners, even in a time of peace, which was not protected by the Constitution. As a matter of fact, it's specifically outlawed by the Constitution, but the Alien Act makes it so that the federal government can decide somebody's a foreigner who's dangerous and deport them even if there's not a war going on at the time. And the third thing he passes is called the Sedition Act. The Sedition Act makes it so that people who speak out against the federal government can be thrown in jail, which goes against which amendment? Remind me. Anybody remember which part of the Bill of Rights that goes against?
First.
The first, that's right. Somebody on Zoom got it, I didn't see who, but the First Amendment specifically says the freedom of speech is protected. But the Sedition Act says those who defame government officials can be thrown in jail. So those are John Adams' big 3 contributions to the government. Say what?
Didn't the Capitol burn?
1812.
No, that was in 1812. Oh, I'm sorry, the Sedition Act. There we go. Okay, so now we have political parties. Hamilton versus Jefferson in the election of 1800. Yes.
Wasn't it like written on John Adams' tombstone? I stopped the war between America and France. He like acted all proud about it.
I don't know. That's a good question.
I think so. That's like I remember. Like you just like I stopped the war because that's what I do.
Oh, okay. I don't know. You'll have to tell me if you find that source because I'm curious. Okay, so let's take a look at the 2 parties that we've got in the election of 1800, when it is Hamilton versus Jefferson, but it's not really, because Hamilton really doesn't stand a chance. So it's really the Federalist Party the Federalists against the Jefferson's Democratic Republics. And I'm just going to go ahead and put this whole thing up here so that we can see the whole thing, because we're running out of time. Okay. So under the Federalists, we have a strong central government. We want the Constitution to be wibbly wobbly. We want to be able to interpret it however we need it. And those who own the land ought to own the government. Landowners should be the ones who vote. And let's expand trade to Europe. Okay, those are the Federalist platform ideologies. They want to spread America's influence to trade with Europe. So they're aimed towards the East. Okay, under Jefferson's Democratic Republicans, we want strong states and a weak federal government. We want the Constitution to be interpreted as strictly as possible, and if the Constitution doesn't have the answer, then states should get to make those laws. Okay, we want to leave the Constitution as weak as possible. And the voting public should be the intellectually capable people. So you shouldn't have to own land, but you should have to prove you're smart enough in order to vote. So there should be a standard educational level that you should achieve in order to vote. But you don't necessarily have to own land. And their priority is to expand out west, to take more land and grow as a nation before they try to negotiate their power with the East. Okay? So they're diametrically opposed on a lot of really critical points. And the Federalists versus the Democratic Republicans, that's going to be a thing for a while. Eventually, those parties are going to shift. The Federalists are going to die out. The Democratic Republicans are going to split. And you'll have Democratic Republicans and Whigs. Eventually, you'll have Democrats and Republicans, but it's going to take a really long time to get there. And even then, those are just names. Those names don't necessarily mean anything. When you start to look at what it is they actually stand for, you realize that Republicans then and Republicans now are completely different. So these are the Republican parties, or these are the political parties we end up with by 1800. So just to recap, when was George Washington elected as the first president? Anybody remember? Yeah, it was the election of 1788. So we started serving in 1789. So from 1788 to 1800, we have our first political parties. So there we go. The two-party system is already in play. Okay, so we covered a lot of random ground today. Does anybody have any questions about any of that? Okay, and then let me show you what your assignment's going to be. It's very simple, but there is a grammatical component, and a lot of the assignments from here on out are going to have grammar as part of them. So I want to make sure that you know. It's like the passive voice one, but it's not the passive voice one. No, the grammar exercise we're going to be working on is about first person writing. Okay, so the question that I'm going to ask you is, which one of the amendments included in the Bill of Rights has the greatest impact on American life? That is an answer that's going to be an opinion. Okay, because you can make an argument for several different ones. So this is your opinion. In your opinion, which one of the amendments in the Bill of Rights, that means the first 10 amendments, sometimes I have students who go like, well, it's the 14th that causes me. Okay, no, this is the first 10 amendments. So which one of the amendments of the Bill of Rights most affects American life, has the greatest impact on American life? All I want you to do is write a quick paragraph explaining why. Pick one and explain why. But you're not allowed to use I or me or we or our. Okay, so you don't say we in our life, you say the American people in their life. Okay, so you're writing this from outside. And you're not allowed to say, I believe, in my opinion, I think. You're not allowed to do that either. Because when you do historical academic writing, you don't do that. You don't say, I think and I believe and this is my opinion, because we already know. It's your paper, of course it's your opinion. It's your paper, of course this is what you think. So you have to get away from the habit of saying those things, even though you know what you're saying is controversial. Yes?
What's yours?
What do I think?
Yeah.
Of which one of the amendments has the greatest impact on American life? By far and away the first, in my opinion. The 8th? Okay. Okay, then that would be the one that you would defend. That would be the one that you choose. And you would just have to explain why, but you have to do it without saying, in my life, or I think, or in our lives, or anything like that. This is a skill. This is a grammatical skill that you have to develop. I'm going to give you these every once in a while, these little grammar assignments, so that when you write your paper, it's obvious that you're writing a historical academic paper and not just a blog post. Okay? So you think the greatest one is no cruel and unusual punishments? Okay, all you have to do is defend it then. Cool. Any other questions about the assignment? Okay, so for the first time, I usually, if you give an attempt to answer the question, I give you 5 points. For the first time, I'm going to cut you off a point for grammar. So all you have to do is not include those phrases. No I, we, our, me, no I think, no in my opinion, no I believe. All you have to do is write it like it's the truth. All you have to do is say, the amendment with the most power to affect human life, American life, is this one. And here's why. Okay? That's a skill, which people have trouble with. Good luck.